Good day, denizens. Welcome to the Jazz Age 1920s, from business culture and booming to the Great Depression and dooming. The 1920s we talk about here, and then roll into the Great Depression and the New Deal in the next Powercast after this. But let's get going here. So if you were to look at this slide here, um, this is someone lamenting about having so many foreign goods that they have to use. Of which country would they be lamenting about? Okay, so basically what we need to know, especially for AP test, basically U.S. society in the 1920s, that it's conservative and liberal. It's kind of like the progressive age in a sense, that it's this kind of paradoxical reality where it's very conservative but also very liberal in the changes, and how there's this kind of battle between fundamentalism and modernism. And essentially that's the root of the discussion for the 1920s. And then of course also the root causes of the Great Depression. How was the U.S. so booming and seemingly so prosperous during the 20s and then completely crashing into the Great Depression of the 30s? Our key terms here. Okay, so in the 1920s, in the U.S. anyway, spirits are very high, right? The U.S. Successfully fought the war. Now, of course, the U.S. still lost 118 or so thousand killed in less than a year of actual fighting. So, spirits and prosperity are high, but there's also still this kind of, moribund feeling, depressive kind of feeling, especially amongst a lot of literary figures and artistically inclined people in this so-called lost generation. But nonetheless, Europe, their economies are obliterated, right? The war destroyed a lot of their infrastructure, drained their treasuries. Whereas in the United States is prosperous. After World War I, the U.S. has the top economy on the planet. But the other thing, too, the U.S. loaned an awful lot of money to the Allied powers in Europe, and the U.S. is asking for their money back, even though those countries are struggling to get by. And it's U.S. loans, that helped those economies recover. The U.S. is going to try to help Germany get bailed out, and then use that money to pay Britain and France, who are supposed to use that money to pay, the United States. But nonetheless, in the U.S. too, I mean, the stock market is booming. Prosperity seems very high, and it seems like this prosperity is just going to keep going and going and going, which it doesn't. There are a lot of underlying weaknesses, a lot of things that people aren't paying attention to with the U.S. economy, U.S. society, U.S. politics, that aren't being addressed in the 20s, but they're going to have to be addressed when it all comes to the fore with the stock market crash and then invariably the Great Depression. Okay, so looking at the United States, domestically in the United States in the 1920s, the KKK kind of reemerged in the 19 teens, but in the 1920s, it falls apart again, which is fantastic. This is kind of, one of the successful sides, I guess, in the 1920s. The organization of the Klan, it had some leadership that were undertaking in criminal activity. Well, they're always undertaking criminal activity, but criminal activity beyond, just the bigotry and attacks on African Americans. One of the leaders was accused, I think, of rape, murder, things like this, and there was a lot of disagreement between various chapters of the Klan and things like this. So it just kind of falls apart as we roll into the 1920s. Native Americans, they get to become citizens in 1927. Kind of interesting considering that they were here all along and beforehand. Some of the other issues, evolution is going to become a huge issue in the midst of the 1920s. It's even going to be put on trial in Dayton, Tennessee. And we'll talk about that here in shortly. The progressives, the movement's kind of faded as we rolled into the 1920s, but we've seen some of the realities of this progressive movement, and one of the positives that comes out are movements to protect civil liberties, and the American Civil Liberties Union will be one of those organizations, non-governmental organization that will come out and work toward protecting American liberties. At the same time, we have this sadness, I guess, within the literary culture, addressed by some of these authors like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, where there's this kind of sense of betrayal and emptiness that was brought about from the destruction of the war and consumerism, and just kind of seeing how U.S. culture has just become this kind of empty, superficial existence. Man, I'm depressed already. Anyway, don't forget, too, that the Great Migration that had occurred throughout the teens is going to contribute then to the 20s explosion of culture in New Orleans. Of course, that's in the South, but more so, well, maybe not more so, but also in the North, since that's where the Great Migration occurs. Places like Harlem, where we're going to see the Harlem Renaissance and the Jazz Age and new literature coming out from African American authors. Baseball is all the rage in the 1920s. Yeah, the NFL is in its very fledgling beginnings, but baseball is, quickly becoming, if it hasn't already at this point, America's sport. And you already have national iconic figures like Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Ty Cobb, Honus Wagner, who was a little bit earlier, but these stars of baseball who have become national stars because of some of the new technologies like radio and film that has created this mass culture. And one of the other big events of the 20s to point out, Charles Lindbergh in 1927 will make his first solo flight across the Atlantic, and he becomes basically a rock star in the United States. Not like literally, but he's very popular. He may have played the guitar, I don't know. Anyway, one of the more conservative sides, though, of the 1920s is going to take place in Dayton, Tennessee. Not Dayton, Ohio, but Dayton, Tennessee. And what goes down there is a guy named John T. Scopes, who is a teacher. He's actually a phys ed teacher who is hired by an organization in Tennessee that wants to challenge a local school board in Dayton, Tennessee, that says that you are not permitted to teach evolution. And Scopes takes it upon himself to go ahead and, teach it to see what happens. And indeed, Scopes is arrested and he's fined. Well, what happens is exactly what officials wanted to happen. A trial is going to ensue. And basically, the people who are going to come out, Clarence Darrow is the defense attorney of the first half of the 20th century in the United States. He was the man. He is who you would hire if you could afford it, if you needed a true defense, a great defense. And there he is. He makes his final appearance, William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan is going to argue in favor of evolution and act as the prosecution in this case. But the whole point of this case, it lasts for, I don't know, a week or so, but it's all about publicity. And people listen to the trial on radio. People get tickets to come sit in the courtroom. At times the courtroom is so hot they actually carry on the trial outside. But nonetheless, this becomes very popular. There's people like selling stuffed monkeys and things like that, to stuffed animals to try to make profit. But the arguments are kind of silly to an extent. It's really just to kind of gain publicity. That being said, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow are both sincere as well in their beliefs. Darrow in this kind of what they would have called in the 20s modernist belief of evolution. Now, of course, he's not saying that religion is wrong or non-existent. All he's arguing is that evolution is a theory, right? So it can be taught. Whereas Bryan is arguing the opposite, that the Bible is the essential truth, and that is what should guide human thinking in this case. But what's most important with the Scopes monkey trial, that's what it comes to be called, is that it shows this divide in the United States between modernism and fundamentalism. This kind of battle that is now ensuing between this younger generation who is practicing things like going out and illegally drinking and dancing and engaging in premarital relations and questioning older generations, things like this, as opposed to fundamentalism, the conservatives who don't want to see these changes and who disagree with these changes. And a lot of this too is rooted in people like the works of people like Sigmund Freud or Albert Einstein, right? Theory of relativity with Einstein and psychoanalysis with Freud. Both of these things kind of questioning the reality that people had long accepted for a couple hundred years, or at least 150 years at this point. All of that is kind of thrown out the window, and it's kind of like, whoa, everything we knew was wrong, right? So there's kind of questioning of reality and leading into this more modernist idealism in the 1920s. Oh, and here's how serious the trial was. These guys would actually get together and go out for drinks afterward, the prosecution team, the defense team. So, yeah. Anyway, the real point of the Scopes Monkey trial is that it shows, American society. It's kind of this snapshot of what's going on in America more broadly, right? Where these social patterns are becoming kind of chaotic, right? The Victorian era, these people born in the Victorian age, the Queen Victoria, are getting older now, right? And they're kind of afraid that these younger generations are ruining everything, right? And everything's falling apart that they had built, right? Whereas the younger peoples, they don't feel like they have to get social approval anymore for their behavior, right? And there's a lot of more experimentation flourishing now, right? Abstract art, Freudian theories, things like this. And, you have new music coming out like jazz and some blues, things like that. And prohibition's going on, very conservative, but you have these younger people who are going out and finding speakeasies, these illegal bars, secret bars, and drinking and carrying on. So there's this real divide, with this older generation and newer generation between modern and fundamental. And basically, this leads to a huge uptick in revivalism, kind of like another great awakening, if you will, where the religious segment of American society is saying, no, wait a second, we're ignoring God's word. We're kind of taking our eye off of what is important for humanity here. So that brings about people like Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday was an interesting cat. This guy actually played Major League Baseball with Cubs and Pirates. He was also an arch alcoholic, and his life kind of fell apart. He gets things back together. He quits baseball and becomes this preacher, a revivalist, evangelical preacher, and goes across the country preaching. And his sermons were absolutely remarkable. I mean, people were just drawn to listening to this guy, to watching this guy. I mean, he preached to over 100 million people, at least in his lifetime. And he's very flamboyant, very theatrical. And, he attacks things, especially like, well, sin, obviously, but most especially things like alcoholism, right? This was one of the big things he spoke out against. And, just stepping back, all of this is this reaction to, modernism and as well materialism, right? That people are kind of focusing on getting material wealth as opposed to focusing on their spiritual well-being. And you can see just from the image that this dude is pretty animated. Watch the clip down here on YouTube. That's an actual clip of a Billy Sunday sermon there. It's good stuff. But nonetheless, he's a big fighter against prohibition. And, basically he just becomes all the rage, and he's really kind of the spokesperson for the more conservative and fundamentalist aspect of the 1920s. Now, of course, his popularity will go down shortly after World War I because people are distracted. They're going to movies, they're listening to radio broadcasts. So it becomes less enticing, I guess, to go out to some of these revivalist meetings that he would hold, these sermons that he would hold. Well, an aspect of the very conservative 1920s would definitely be the 1924 Immigration Act. This Immigration Act is the most restrictive act passed on immigration in United States history. And it's very much reflective not only of the conservatism and social Darwinism of the United States, but also the progressives. This is kind of like their big last salvo, really. Because they thought, of course, that they're improving American society, right? Basically, what the Immigration Act does is it creates quotas. it says, okay, only so many people can come from these various places around the planet, right? And they literally had numbers, fixed numbers for how many people could come from what place. How they fixed those numbers, I'm not entirely sure. But like, for example, the entire continent of Africa, I think like per year, 1,000 people could come, something just ridiculous like that. But nonetheless, they had these quotas. Of course, the numbers were set higher for places like Western Europe, Britain, and Britain. But the numbers, of course, much lower for Southern Europe, Southeastern Europe. The numbers are 0 for places like China and Japan, for example. That being said, the Immigration Act, they didn't set quotas for Mexico or the Western Hemisphere, right? Because by not setting limits here, you have the farmers down in Southern California who have, need seasonal labor. So in this case, the United States wants to exploit that cheap labor, so they're willing to, allow people to come in to do that. But, nonetheless, this is very much part of this conservative strain of the 1920s with this Immigration Act. And you can see here who it favored and who it did not. And this was actually the beginning of having, official border patrols on the U.S. border with Mexico. Now, once again, Mexican citizens were allowed to come in, but the fear here was that people from other, quote, non-desirable places, unquote, would get into Mexico and then find their way into the United States. So you would have border patrol officials such as these down there doing what he's doing. But this conservatism, bleeds over into politics too, not just socially and culturally, but also politically. The Republicans are going to control the presidency for the duration of the 20s. Warren Harding is elected in 1920 from Ohio, and he promised a, quote, return to normalcy, unquote. And, what he's talking about there is this idea that, not being involved in world affairs, like with the Europeans and the World War, getting away from that, right? More focus on business. This was kind of the norm, a more conservative understanding of society. These were, the normal for the Republicans, especially guys like Harding. In the 1920s, employers are going to gain more power. But there's a big reason for that, and unions will decline. There's a big reason for that is because many of these employers were making so much money that they were actually able to address a lot of the things that workers were angry about, like wages. Some of these workplaces, what they'll call welfare capitalism, some of these workplaces will actually allow or have things like daycare for children, even limited healthcare type plans, pensions, these types of things. So really what the workers had been complaining about, what unions have been complaining about, are somewhat addressed by companies, right? And things seem so prosperous that unions just kind of decline. Voter turnout, though, actually drops substantially. And there are a few reasons for this. Number one, the Solid South. Number two, the Republicans just constantly dominating. And believe it or not, women get the right to vote by 1919, 1920, but then they don't turn out to vote. There's a low turnout. And the other big thing about the conservatism here is that the Republicans are very much pro-business in the 20s. The White House, the government is all about supporting business. Business and government really become one in the midst of the 1920s. And Congress continues to limit immigration and everything else. But the government and business are very much fused as we roll through the 20s. More ideas of conservatism. 1922, the Cable Act is passed in the American Congress, yes, which basically said if a woman marries an Asian American, she loses her citizenship. Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, this is an aspect of this kind of conservatism. It's finally repealed in 1936, but these are the realities of this conservative 20s, right? Prohibition is somewhat successful. Alcohol is limited, but it also creates the mafia, Al Capone, and more and more crime in the United States, organized crime. But a lot of fundamentalists are very much still in support of prohibition. You also have this kind of backlash against the lost generation and some of these authors like Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Um, and one example is Roman Catholic, the Watch and Ward Society in Boston, where they just banned certain books by guys like Sinclair Lewis and Hemingway and Upton Sinclair because these books didn't kind of fit with the conservative ethos. They had stuff in them that seemed derogatory. So you actually have this phrase called banned in Boston, where there's a lot of censorship on literature coming out at this time. Books that today, we would read in a class because they're considered some of the great works. And after Harding, Warren Harding actually dies in office. This guy, Calvin Coolidge, takes over, old Silent Cal. And his famous quote, "The business of the American people is, business." And he was called Silent Cal because he actually didn't say a whole heck of a lot. Some of the big things he was known for, or actually the biggest thing, other than not talking, were his naps in the White House. He kind of viewed it as, hey, the economy's going well, so why rock the boat? Let things keep going. Make sure people stay out of the way of business interests. Calvin Coolidge actually had a mechanical horse in the White House that he kept in there. He would ride it every evening for a good amount of time and then break out into a big sweat. That was like his exercise, and he'd go eat dinner and then I guess go back to sleep. I don't know. Coolidge, though, really captures this conservative ethos as well as this big business and government melding. Coolidge, in terms of his silence, actually went to a dinner party once. He sat next to one of these wealthy denizen, a woman, and she looks at him and she says, "Sir, I bet I can get you to say more than 3 words tonight." And Coolidge responds with, "You lose." Yeah. Anyway, U.S. banks are very much empowered during this time. They're making loans to the Europeans. They're making loans to Latin American governments and, quite frankly, controlling Latin American governments and banks. The U.S. is creating, international firms around the world, investing in copper mines and oil in various countries, especially in Latin America, and supporting some pretty ruthless dictators in various places like Somoza down in Nicaragua. So really this is U.S. foreign policy at this time, very much focused on Latin America and business and economics. Women. Well, we tend to think of the 1920s as the era of the beginnings, I guess, of women's liberation. And to an extent that's true, and to an extent it is not. There you see the cover of Life magazine, and you can see that is a flapper there. Flappers would dress scantily like that. Notice the shortness of the dress, the bobbed hair, wearing the makeup, smoking, wearing the jewelry, and you would go out to a speakeasy, right, and drink. And this was considered part of this kind of radical aspect of American society. These modernists, but also these youths run wild. Another thing to point out too, you see the ERA movement. That's not earned run average. That's the Equal Rights Amendment. That had been proposed in the Progressive Era, a little early in the Progressive Era, and it was this idea that the Constitution should be amended to say that men and women are totally equal in every avenue of life and have to be treated that way in every avenue. It actually kind of dies out in the 20s, though it's going to make a big comeback in the 60s. And actually, the ERA almost becomes an amendment to the Constitution. It finally fails, I think, in 1982 or 83. It had to get 3/4 of the states to be an amendment. I think it got like 30-some states, believe it or not. Nonetheless, so women felt like they were liberated in the 20s, especially with the consumer market, right? But this is the thing, they adopt all these new styles and so on, but these styles, these hairdos and makeup and perfumes, these things are being sold by the likes of Coco Chanel and industry, right? Well, marketing, advertising is the big industry also of the 20s. So basically what these industries are doing is they're convincing these women what to wear. They're convincing them how to look, right? So it's really more that these women are conforming to a standard. So really what's happening is it's not so much that they're being liberated as they're kind of being manipulated, right? And they're all just kind of falling into this kind of advertising trap, as are most other Americans at this time. But nonetheless, flappers, these are the things that they did. But, with all these vices and all these things going on, I mean, that's ideal for advertising, right? Vices sell for advertising, and they're going to make plenty of money off of women. In Japan, if you took on that flapper appearance, you could actually be arrested if you came out in public, wearing makeup. And the 1920s and, of course, progressive era before it are known for their consumerism and the whole idea of a standard of living, and we've talked about this. But increasingly, too, with the 1920s, we're seeing this creation of mass civilization as well as Americanization. There is this major movement to assure that the people who are here from other places are Americanized, whatever that is, that they kind of forget their culture from, Poland or Italy or wherever, and that they become American. And you see this in the schools, in society, and so on. And this kind of combined with limiting immigration itself, right? But the creation of this mass civilization and Americanization is played out now in radio, motion pictures, the Nickelodeons, transportation, because more and more Americans have more contact and more access to information than ever before at this point. And increasingly, Americans are willing to go into debt to buy stuff, and there is a cornucopia of goods by the millions. And things like advertising are convincing Americans that, not only is it a good idea to have a car or a vacuum cleaner or one of these, electric washer and dryers or whatever, not that they should have it, but that they need it. And people are willing to go into debt to purchase some of these things. They're also willing to go into debt to purchase stocks, what we call buying on margin, talk about later. And work itself, this whole idea of pride and in your craft, skill, and work has pretty much died at this point. Right now, it's about getting money so you can buy more stuff, so that you can get more money to be entertained by all the new entertainment that's out there: baseball, movies, theater, and so on. And you can see some of the advertising coming out, right? Here, this advertisement basically says that cigarettes will help you break the chains, right? By smoking, you'll be liberated. Absolutely unbelievable. This is the era where they, could argue that smoking was healthy, and obviously it's the total opposite. It will kill you. But this is how advertising worked. And notice too, you see the red, white, and blue, the star there. Maybe that's Uncle Sam, perhaps. So these are advertisers once again, connecting liberty and purchasing goods. Babe Ruth being used to sell goods because he's this national icon, right? So hey, if Babe Ruth likes these things, then you probably should too. And you can see, how many household appliances now are being purchased. So, numerous households having these types of things, electricity, telephones, but also just some of these consumer things like, refrigerators and so on. And the biggest thing, though, is that they're willing to go into debt to acquire these things. So you do have liberal movements in the 20s. We talked about a couple, but more. Oregon is going to be the first to actually require all students to attend public school, which is, universal today. But 1922, Oregon's the first state to say, hey, you have to go to school. We talked about the ERA earlier, but the ERA talks about this idea that sex or gender should not be used, to determine whether or not you have rights as an individual. The Supreme Court, somewhat liberal as well. Louis Brandeis, for example, defended civil liberties usually with dissenting arguments because the court's still conservative. But he said those who won our independence believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. The greatest menace to freedom is an inert people. So you have the Supreme Court, or a Supreme Court justice, I should say, arguing more liberal ideas of how people can live or should live in society. And indeed, it's in the 20s and 30s where the 14th Amendment is finally taken seriously by the Supreme Court, and they begin to use it, to protect American freedoms and civil liberties. And here you see just a little FYI, but it is kind of interesting to see how much stuff cost back then. Now this one shows us something very important. So we're going to be talking about the Great Depression here in a minute. And if you notice here, look at the food prices. Just take potatoes, the first one there. For 10 pounds of potatoes, 63 cents in 1920. The same 10 pounds of potatoes are only 36 cents, almost cut in half by 1925. Hey, that's fantastic if you're a consumer. That's disastrous if you are a farmer. And basically, when World War I ends, the demand for agricultural products, understandably, is going to drop. But during the Great War, farmers were told to produce. So as a farmer, well, what do? You buy more land, you buy more machinery, more fertilizer, and all these things, thinking that you're going to keep making wealth, right? And the more you produce, the more money you're going to make. Problem is, the war ends, and all of a sudden, prices for these goods just plummet. So really, for farmers, the Great Depression starts right at the end of World War I. So by the time the Great Depression starts for everyone else in the 30s, the farmers have already been in a depression for about 10 years. American culture, you can see one of the big things here with window shopping that becomes a huge fad in the 1920s with department stores and so on. And in American culture too, cars suddenly replace, what railroads once were, right? The economy that so much revolved around railroads in the 19th century is going to come to revolve around cars now as we roll into the 1920s. And that is due in large part to the assembly line, right? Henry Ford, 1913, and this mass production of goods. And remember, mass production of goods drops prices and makes them more affordable to more people, especially if you're willing to go into debt to purchase those things. And welfare capitalism, we talked about a few minutes back, actually like 30, sorry. But nonetheless, these were kind of these internal welfare systems, right, where basically businesses would have things like retirement benefits, healthcare, employee profit sharing, like, investing your money for retirement, things like that. Because these businesses, many of them were so prosperous, or at least thought they were, that they could give these things to employees to keep them from striking, to keep them from joining labor unions. So basically what happens is workers say, I don't need to be in the union anymore. So union membership, crashes in the 1920s. Millions leave unions. So what we see here is more advertising in the 1920s, and here is where a big transition takes place with how we think about cars. This was actually a song, if you want to listen to it. I think the link still works. That Henry's Made a Lady Out of Lizzie, and basically they start comparing cars, saying that your car is female, right? And this kind of begins this male obsession with cars and thinking of your car as feminine. But that sells cars. Some of the other mass entertainment, things like Coney Island, a theme park in New York that you could go to. There it is, roller coaster. I don't ride roller coasters now, let alone back then. No, thank you. The theater. Rudolph Valentino, he was actually one of these first iconic heartthrob actors. You see him there on the left. This is him in The Sheik in 1921. This would have been a silent film. Films don't have sound until the very end of the 1920s, but nonetheless, this was part of this mass culture. And, everybody would have known who Rudolph Valentino was, especially the ladies, right? He was one of these heartthrobs. Sadly, he ends up dying very young of tuberculosis, I think in the late 20s or early 30s. But all of that prosperity, what on earth happens? I mean, how did all of this come crashing down into the prolonged misery that is the Great Depression? How on earth could this have happened? And some of these images that you see here, one of my favorites here, you see it says on this sign on the bottom left, it says the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way, but those people standing in front of it there, that's a soup line because they have lost everything. You see in the top middle picture, that is a Hooverville, because this entire depression, for the most part in the American mindset, will be blamed on Herbert Hoover. He's the president at the time, and typically as the economy goes, so goes the president. For better or worse, whether it's true or not, that's usually how it goes. And a Hooverville basically was a town of shacks that are thrown together by various things like cardboard and plywood and whatever, because you've lost your home. So now you're living in a Hoover hotel, your little home there. And of course, if your pockets are empty, you can pull out your pockets. Those are Hoover flags. If you're sleeping on a park bench and your only blanket is a newspaper, well, that's all right, because that's known as a Hoover blanket. Here are the realities of the economy in the 1920s, though. This is what they're kind of ignoring, or they're not aware of, that really causes the Great Depression. The stock market crash doesn't cause the Great Depression, but the stock market crash shows the weaknesses in the economy, right? And basically, it's all these weaknesses that cause the depression. So basically, for example, 1,200 mergers, right? So fewer independent companies means fewer jobs, right? And it also means that if you have fewer companies dominating the economy, well, what happens when some of those companies go out of business? The next one there, the top 0.1% of U.S. families in 1929 had an income worth as much as the bottom 42% of all of American society. You want to talk about an uneven distribution of wealth, right? Per capita income in the U.S., in other words, your money that you would make, or money per person, rose 9%. That's great, right? But per capita income for the top 24,000 families in the country rose by 75%. 8 out of 10 American families had no savings at all. And farmers, of course, we talked about, already in the Depression. Now, one of the kind of misunderstood things about the 1920s, less than 10% of people were actually invested in the stock market, right? But nonetheless, I mean, the market's going to crash and those people are going to be out as well. Okay, so I basically have 5 or 6 main causes of the Great Depression here. Like I said, it's not the stock market crash, right? The crash is kind of the warning sign, the symptom of all these underlying causes. So number one, the uneven distribution of wealth, right? Real wages, like a real wage. In other words, how much money you earn relative to what things actually cost, right? Rose by 25% for industrial workers. Nice. Corporate profits, though, rose by 50%. A few firms dominated economic sectors. 1% of banks controlled 50% of the nation's resources. If those banks go out of business, so does the country. In 1929, the top 5% of wealth earners in the United States controlled 33%, 1/3 of all personal income. 60%, 6 out of 10 U.S. families had an annual income at the poverty level or below, right? $2,000 a year, which today, for example, that would be like a family of 3 or 4 only earning $20,000 to $25,000 a year. 40% of U.S. families lived in absolute poverty. Ironically, or surprisingly, Americans were actually buying less by the time we roll into the 1920s. Americans increasingly were working in the service sector as opposed to the manufacturing sector, meaning that they're offering a service, but they're not actually making something palatable, something tangible and real to actually sell, right? A lot of cheaper labor is being found elsewhere by these companies, outsourcing basically, right? So, basically what all this does is this lowers productivity, it lowers the amount of goods being made, right? Productivity actually improves during this time, right? Because more machines, more mechanization, making more stuff. But if you have machines making stuff, you don't have humans making stuff, so that also means fewer jobs. By 1930, the reality is this: 75% of Americans actually didn't own a washing machine, 60% didn't own a radio, and 50% didn't own a car. So what's going on here? How is it that people were thinking that the economy is so prosperous if people aren't actually buying all of this stuff? Yeah. After 1926, new car sales stagnated. Overproduction, another major cause. The war told farmers to produce more, so they did. They went into debt to produce more. And that's going to be it, because once the war ends, there's less demand. You have a glut of goods on the international market. You have more competition from Latin American producers, which is going to drop prices, which means you can't pay off your loans. When you can't pay off your loans for your house or your land or your farm machinery, well, the bank is going to repossess it. The bank needs to make a profit off of that stuff. So what does the bank do? Well, the bank has to sell it to recoup its costs. But here's the question: to whom are they going to sell it? We see thousands of foreclosures going throughout the 1920s, right? So I mean, things are not looking good economically, behind the scenes in the 1920s. Then we have credit and advertising, right? These advertisers convincing people that they have to purchase this item, right? That they couldn't live without that new toaster or new refrigerator or whatever, right? Yeah, that's fine, I guess. But the thing is that increasingly people are willing to go into debt to get it. People are convinced by the only 10% down motto, right? Here's this $100 item, but you only have to pay $10 for it, right? You can pay us back in installment plans with interest, of course, right? But, you assume over the longer term that you can pay these things back. But of course, if the economy crashes and you lose your job, you can't pay these things back. People went into massive amounts of debt. But of course, they also had investments, some of them in the stock market. Yeah, we'll see how that goes too. And interestingly, there's a huge real estate speculation bubble that bursts in Florida in the midst of the 1920s as well. That should sound familiar to recent times. But the other big one is over-speculation. Basically, this whole idea of stock speculation gave people this kind of false sense of prosperity, right? Business owners themselves, as well as consumers and producers. The stock market just only seemed to be going up. So if the stock market is always going up, well, that must mean that these businesses are making tons of money. Economy's great. But this is the reality. There were no regulations on the stock market back then, right? So your $100 stock wasn't really a $100 stock, right? When the rubber hit the road, and people started to question, wait a second, if productivity numbers are going down and I notice that people are being laid off, well, maybe stock in this company isn't worth as much as I thought. I have this $20 stock, I'll sell it for $15. And then you go to sell it and you find that you can only get $2 for it, right? So basically, or nothing for it. So basically, these stocks that people thought were so valuable were really worthless. Things like insider trading. Insider trading was perfectly legal back then. You could give a tip to your buddy that you're going to sell off 1,000 shares and give him a tip to also get out, right? And all of a sudden that undercuts whatever company, which then undercuts whoever had stock in that company and, of course, the people employed by that company. And two, people had put complete faith into corporations, right? Ever since the Gilded Age, corporations were to be kind of trusted, right? And especially with advertising, convincing people of this. And more so, people bought stock on margin, meaning that you would buy, for example, 1,000 shares of a $5 stock, but only put 10% down. So you only pay 50 cents on this, $5 stock, right? So times 1,000, you're going into a large amount of debt. But hey, the stock market's constantly going up, so I'll pay that off in no time. No. So this becomes reality. Here's your Hooverville, the shantytown outside of Seattle. So all of these things basically lead to the crash, right? Because companies can't sell goods, store owners buy less from producers, the factories. Because they had to reduce production, factories lay off employees. Because families have no income, they buy even less, causing factories to cut production further and lay off more employees. Families now had no income to buy the glut of goods that were on the market. They could not repay the banks for the money they borrowed, and the banks went out of business. Because remember, the banks, when they repossess that stuff, they've got to sell it. But who's going to buy it? No one. On top of that, there is no federal deposit insurance. The government is not going to back up your money at this time. So if you have money in the bank goes out of business, you don't have money in the bank. And the downward spiral goes on, and the entire economy just tanks by the time we're into the early 1930s. Game over. By 1933, 1/4 of Americans are unemployed. That is a huge number. Germany will see upwards of 35% unemployed. Other places in Europe will also see huge in the 20% percentiles of unemployment. And the crash. Well, Hoover's the president at the time, and his response, believe it or not, is actually to expand government. He actually increases taxes. There's an increase in the tariff, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which is the largest tariff in American history. They actually create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to give loans to failing businesses. They create a federal home loan bank system. The government actually is getting involved. One of the misunderstood things about Hoover is people say, well, he doesn't do anything to help the economy. He doesn't try to get the government involved. It's the total opposite. He tries to get the government involved completely. But the problem is, it's just too late. On top of that, when you pass something like the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which basically just says we're pretty much not going to trade with foreign countries for the most part, right? Because we want American goods to be purchased by American consumers. Other countries pass their own tariffs, and the global economy, global trade comes to a complete standstill. And poor Herbert Hoover is going to be blamed for this whole thing, but any president who would have been in there at that time, Democrat, Republican, it wouldn't have mattered. The market was going to crash and the Great Depression was going to happen. And that's all for this. Thanks for tuning in.